Naptown Tuner here, like and subscribe. So I'm going to tell a furnace story. And this is my history with a furnace. I've been a homeowner for roughly 10 years now. And basically, whenever I first moved in, I thought that I could close the registers in a couple of my rooms that I don't use. And then the hot air would circulate better in the rest of the house, and I wouldn't spend as much money in gas. Well, you can't do that. So the furnace ended up going out after a while, and I had to call a professional. He came out here and supposedly this is what he fixed. This is a 30-year-old furnace, by the way. So he replaced this igniter. That's what he told me that he replaced. Let me get the flashlight in here. There's a hot surface igniter in this first jet, and that's a very common failure item. You see these two wires going through there, and on this other side there's a flame sensor through here. I actually took all these out and cleaned all these jets, and we'll get to that, what all I did. But he didn't tell me, any tips or what was going on. I don't really know if that's what was wrong with it or not, but shortly after he left, like maybe a week later, the same kind of scenario happened because, well, I still had those registers closed. And really what happens is the furnace is designed to operate with everything open, and it has to get the heat out. It can't hold the heat in. So, and trust me, I'm not an expert on this. Tell me stuff in the comments. But, so you can overheat the furnace because it's not properly getting all the heat through the registers, and it will trip one of these rollout sensors. What most recently happened with my furnace was after I got it going again, which was a little bit of an ordeal because I messed a few things up. We got these limit switches. These are flame rollout switches. There's two of them on either side right here. This is a little bit of a different flow sensor back here, and there's a limit switch in this inducer motor, and then there's one in my blower motor back here. Now previously, years ago, I had to replace this blower motor, and that's just because it failed. It just stopped working. But since I've learned that, for a while, I even went without an air filter just because I'm silly and I try different stuff. I'm like, well, why does it really need an air filter? If the furnace is going, it can burn up the dust. Well, it doesn't work that way either. Trust me, I'm silly. So the dust can cake on this fan right here, and then you can get reduced airflow and have other problems. And it can also get caught in your A coil, which there's a AC system down here. And I've taken all this apart and I've looked at my A coil, and it's fairly clean still, luckily. I didn't go that long without an air filter, but I've got a new air filter in there. Where was I? So let me just tell you real quick what this situation is. The furnace has been working for a couple days now perfectly fine. And it was ultimately this flame rollout switch right here, which I still need to buy a new one. But after I got everything going again, which ultimately I had to replace this board, and I don't think that I had to replace this board. I think I screwed this board up. If they're all called flame rollout sensors, I don't know, but they all look the same, and there's no part number on them. So ultimately, all I had to do to get this thing going again was to switch this flame rollout sensor with this one right here, because this one in the flue, it's got a manual reset button on it. Some of these are automatic resets, but mine has a manual reset button on it. So, and also, this board right here, my furnace is so old that it does not have a LED. A lot of these are extremely easy to diagnose because it will have a flashing LED, and then you can go up here and go through these trouble codes, which I don't know why I have an LED status code right here and all these lists, but I replaced my board with another board exactly like the one I found in it, and there's no LED light on here, and there was no LED light on the one that I replaced. So I know that for sure. This board was not hard to replace. The fan was not hard to replace. anyway, I probably still need to replace this rollout switch because I swapped these. I swapped the one in my inducer to the one right here in my burners. And from what I can tell, this one doesn't get near as hot right here in the backside of the burners than this one does in the flue. So this one was pretty consistently tripping, like maybe 10 minutes after the furnace would start up, and I would have to go in here and reset it. And typically that's not a good sign when you have to reset these, but they can also go bad as well. So that's what my situation was, especially since all I did was swap it from here to here and it's been working again. And I'm gonna, like I said, I'm ultimately gonna buy probably 2 more of these just to have another one on hand. I think that everyone should, typically you can just clean these flame sensors. You can use a Scotch-Brite pad or very fine emery cloth. You can just take this quarter screw out and clean that. That's a reason, very, very common reason why the furnace quits working. And also, yes, this igniter is a very common reason why the furnace quits working. The igniter back there in number 1 jet. So I did end up replacing the I didn't really know exactly what was going on. Like ultimately my inducer motor was just running all the time. And then if I would turn it off and turn it back on, the blower motor would kick on for 90 seconds and then the inducer motor would turn on and then nothing else would happen. And I was going up here trying to find it and it was code 12. Blower on, after power up. But really I guess that's a normal thing that would happen. So what I ultimately ended up, after I reset all of these rollout switches, I had this igniter just laying out here, and I noticed the igniter was trying to come on. Ultimately, I went ahead and replaced the igniter, and whenever I went ahead and put the new igniter in here, you see it's tucked in there pretty good, but I had it, see, so you just take out this screw right here. You take out this screw right here, and someone had a longer screw. I don't know if that's definitely probably not supposed to be that long, but I just put the same screw back in. You take out this screw right here and you can have a little bit more room, but at first I didn't. At first I just tried to take this screw out, which kind of is too long anyway, and I just tried to put the new one in, and this was, so like this one's burnt out. You see where it burnt out right there? So whenever I put the new one in, unfortunately, it was arced out on the body. I didn't know, because this little piece of metal right here is a little bit flimsy. So whenever I turned it back on to test it, as soon as it called for heat for this thing, it arced out. Ever since then, the board fried. Why did I know the board fried? Because it's like the relay was sticking on. Because after that, whenever I finally replaced this igniter, it was on at all time. If I turned the switch on, if I turned the power on, the igniter would instantly glow. And I know that's not supposed to instantly glow. It's supposed to come on shortly after. It's hard to kind of go through all this and explain it, but I knew that I had an igniter that was on all the time. Even whenever the burners would come on, the igniter stayed on. I knew that was wrong. So ultimately I figured out that the board was bad. I fried the board based on internet information. Very hard to find. Only one other person on the internet said that they did that. Same thing I did. Blew this igniter after install and fried the board. Someone said you probably fried your board. Anyway, I bought a used one. Everything worked, and then ultimately the flames kept on kicking off. And I thought that it was my flame sensor. But what it really was, before I put this board back in all the way, I had everything plugged in. Now this is just a heat type shield and a dust shield. Before I had everything plugged in on this board, right? But I did not bolt it down yet. I was testing it without the board bolted down. And guess what? The board has to be grounded. These bolts right here ground to the chassis of the furnace, if you will. And since this board was not bolted down whenever I was testing it, this flame kept on stopping after like 3 seconds. So it was like flame sensor issue, which was what I was thinking. So I bought a flame sensor and that didn't fix it. ultimately I learned like an idiot, well, I just need to put stuff together all the way and then retest it. So I bolted the board in, retested it, and then finally it started working. Everything was working. The burners were kicking on for like 10 minutes straight, but then it would stop. Had another issue after I fixed all my screw ups. The screw ups were I shorted out my igniter, and then I didn't bolt my board back in. Once I had all that sorted, then I learned finally that my rollout switch right here and the inducer kept on tripping. And I checked all my registers, I cleaned all my vents, I took out all these pipes all the way up here. I cleaned out everything to make sure everything was flowing well. There was a bunch of crud in there that I vacuumed out. I cleaned my blower motor. I cleaned my jets. I went through everything and cleaned everything. And then ultimately I didn't feel like buying another part and waiting for another part. So I just, like I probably already said, I swapped this rollout sensor for this rollout sensor. This one gets a lot hotter. Supposedly this gets like 300 to 400 degrees in an 80% furnace for the flue. And this one was tripping right here, but whenever I swapped it, this one doesn't get near as hot in this location. The flame pattern is perfect. You know, everything is working great. So ultimately I still need to replace that rollout switch, that flame switch, and it looks like they've already replaced something similar to that in 2009, almost 2010, that middle one, that air switch, that reverse flow limit switch. That could have been what they're calling. It's been working perfectly fine, and I know for sure that this switch was bad because it consistently, time after time, like 3 different times, was tripping this switch until I swapped it with this one, and now it's been perfectly fine for like 2 days straight. So there we go. So when I call for heat on the thermostat, this inducer motor is supposed to turn on, and then shortly after that, this igniter is supposed to warm up. It'll warm up any second now. There it goes. And then shortly after that, the flames will kick on. This gas valve will turn on. It'll click. There we go. And this flame sensor right here detects the flame, and it allows the flame to stay on for 3 seconds. Now that my board is stinking bolted in. And then shortly after that, the blower motor will kick on after it gets hot enough. The heat exchanger has to get hot enough. And there goes the blower motor. Alright, now I got hot air coming out the vents. Furnace is operating just as designed.